Before I make an introduction and everything else, if you look at your control panel, there is a tab for questions. We'd appreciate it if you would enter your questions in there, and we'll try to get to them either through the presentation or at the end of the presentation. Once again, to the attendees, I want to thank you all for taking the time to be here today. And I'd like to introduce Patrick Leary, Director of Business Development for Telrad. As you guys are here today, you want to learn more about Telrad and what they're offering, products, and kind of the technologies they're doing today. Just to give you a quick thing, they are basically leading the path of the movement from, basically WiMAX to your LTE platforms and your 365, your 2.5 and other frequencies. But I'm going to let Patrick get into that. So I want to thank you all for I want to thank all y'all for being here today and taking the time. I want to thank Patrick Leary and let him get the ball rolling. Okay.
Jeff, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, very good. Do me a favor, as questions pop up, in the case that I don't see them, don't be bashful about jumping in there and letting me know. So good morning, everyone. This is Patrick Leary from Telrad. Much thanks to DoubleRadius for setting this up, and it looks like there's a good number of folks in on this call, including actually a couple folks already under trial. So, for example, hello, David in Michigan. I've got a couple of my colleagues on the call. They'll be in listen mode unless I need to bring them in particular, Nick Dewar up in Canada, who's sitting at a customer site, but he's in a quiet room for the moment. And if we really need him with some of your questions, I'll pull him in. So thank you for joining. We've got quite a bit of content. Please do ask in the midst of it, and we'll try to get to it. So this is called Telrad LTE Solutions for Fixed Applications, moving the industry from props to jets. A bit of a provocative statement, not uncommon for me to do that kind of thing, but I really think it's true. I hate the term paradigm, but we believe this is a shift even beyond a generational shift in technology. We think it's really to that next stage of where the industry is going. And we do think we are leading the pack, as Jeff said. You can have a viable business leading or following. Leading is a heck of a lot more fun, but there's certainly more risk involved. But so far, it seems to be paying off. People are experiencing some pretty amazing things, and I hope to show you some of that stuff. So first, who the heck is Telrad? I didn't know this, but it had to be around because it's a 6-letter URL, so I knew they were at least old enough to go since 1951. And the DMS 100 switches that Nortel sold into the rural markets that were very common, arguably kind of the standard for those sorts of small market switches, was actually made by Telrad, but just private labeled by Nortel. And there was a point at which Nortel was a 20% owner. So when Nortel went kaboom, the former Telrad kind of went kaboom along with it because too much of its eggs were in that basket. But ultimately, they migrated their rural telecom roots from wireline to wireless, and kind of here we are today. Those pictures are actual real Telrad pictures, which I think are kind of funny. This looks like you could see Alexander Graham Bell in the background here, but those are real pictures of Telrad, so they go back quite a ways. We're larger than people think. Sometimes it may be which there's only about 7 of us, but we do have a pretty good size operation behind us. Of interest, there's a couple subsidiaries here which have become relevant recently. For example, Magalcom makes high-end data centers, and that was what the company was doing before they went back into the hardware space, because that was the easiest way to kind of come back from the dead so many years ago. But this company even builds network soup to nuts, but mostly in developing regions like the African continent, that sort of thing. But they do network caching. They do over-the-top TV services and a number of interesting things that may end up being relevant here in the States before too long. But what do we do really that anyone cares about here, including myself? So we've taken LTE, which we all are carrying around in our pockets for our mobile devices, and priced it, we think. That's debatable, right, to some. That's for you to judge. For small to mid-size fixed wireless broadband operators. So even though we're still completely standards-based, we have some plus features, kind of like adding a a ladder rack to your pickup truck. The pickup is still standard, but it's got the ability to do a couple extra things. So in our case, we're doing some things that we know the fixed market needs, but isn't otherwise supported in LTE, to include layer 2 services, static IP, the ability to integrate with radius, that sort of thing. And we've done it in a way that, for example, a network core in the LTE world can be hundreds of thousands of dollars, literally, and we're down to sub a couple K per cell site, even in some models. So we do think we're onto something. Not just base stations, but the truth is the solution covers kind of the ecosystem, right? From the CPE, or in the LTE vernacular, what they call UE, which is user equipment. In other words, that cell phone you're carrying around in the LTE world, that would be considered a UE. And we make the base stations, but we also make the core piece, which is the CPC we'll discuss here, and we also make our own NMS. In the old days, a lot of these things were developed in concert as third-party OEM pieces. That's not the case anymore. This stuff is in-house. So these are software-defined radios, and this is really what's making kind of everything happen. These are new boxes, originally working under the WiMAX software. We've been able to port LTE into this new hardware platform. It is available in a couple different flavors. The two primary flavors are what they call the Compact 1000 and the Compact 3000. The 1000 is really for the light licensed or licensed exempt markets. You've heard that there's the 365 version. What you may not know is that there is also a version for, frankly, 4.9 to, well, in your instance, you'd really consider it 5.15 to 5.25. Yes, it's low power, but it's still pretty quiet spectrum in large parts of the country. And we have a couple people that are trialing this and getting really good results, predominantly because the spectrum is so quiet there, not so much noise. But the challenge here is that while we can make this run in LTE mode, there is yet no CPE available in 5 gig for LTE. We're dependent on the market's chipset availability. Gig. This, I don't much care to have this on the slide because this is future, and I really don't know what future means. So for the point of the conversation, let's just talk about these two. But this is the one that most people are working with. You can see the operational range is actually 3.4 to 3.7. That's because this radio is also sold in much of the international markets, where the band is increasingly similar to now what the US band looks like. These are 30 dBm per port. They're actually pretty small. They are quote unquote compact. You're talking about 17 pounds, heavier than a lot of things you might be used to, but much smaller than this grade of gear typically is. The interfaces, so you can kind of get an understanding on that. Sometimes they overlooked it, so I actually put this on the slide last night. You've got your basic mounting kit mounts, which do come with it. Got your power. There's a 10100 port, and this 10100 is both for in-band and out-of-band management. So you could direct connect to backhaul, for example, if you wanted. There's a Gig E port, and there's also an SFP. If Mike's out there, I'm sure he's happy about that. but this has been on the plan kind of since day one. We wanted to give people the option to do both. There's 2 GPS ports. There's in and out. There's an out because we can sync up to 3 base stations to 1 GPS, which is kind of the most common model now that I see people deploying, at least here in the US. Additionally, of course, we've got the 4 RF ports up top. These are the end connectors. If you remember nothing else about this base station, this is one of the reasons why we argue we're having so much success, is it literally changes in this business. You're changing out your infrastructure every couple of years because the capabilities of that gear, whatever it is, no longer seems to provide what's needed in the marketplace. So these things are software-defined, true software-defined radios. There's at least 8 cores in there. In fact, there's a recent hardware edition, which is another story of another daughter board. But there's a lot of latent capacity in this radio that we can add additional LTE feature sets as time moves on. Things like coordinated multipoint, self-organizing networks, multi-user MIMO. And these things, as they get added, essentially turn this radio into something much greater than it currently exists, with complete backward compatibility with CPE and everything else, but it does all that without climbing a tower. So that the radio we're talking about today, which in LTE mode in a 20 megahertz channel is yielding about 100 megs, tomorrow this is too aggressive because I'm learning I need to hedge my bets. So let's say spring or maybe early summer of 2016, we're talking about that same radio without a climb doubling to about 200 megs. So when you have something like that, it's like you have a whole new infrastructure without a climb, without additional cost. So this is more like a, kind of like a 5 to 7 year CapEx play as opposed to maybe a 2 to 3 year. And that's a really, really important point. Additionally, and there is a fair bit of dumb luck here on our part, this radio covers, as I mentioned, from 3.4 to 3.7. So you'll notice that includes the range of 3.55 to 3.7, which is the new band as being reconfigured by the FCC recently as of April 7. So one of the rules of that new band requires gear to be able to operate across the entire 150 megahertz of that spectrum. But under the new rules, new gear has to be able to do the entire range. This radio does. In fact, it goes beyond that. It goes from 3.4 to 3.7. So we're good there. The second, we'll be able to communicate with the SAS, hopefully just with a software piece, but worst case would be via the software load into the EPC. But either way, it's just software that will be able to interface with the SAS, so there won't be an additional hardware piece. So that's cool. So we're good there because that's also going to be a requirement. But one thing that I think is really big, and I don't think there's any of our competition that can say this, is we'll be able to leverage the entire new power allowed by the FCC in some of the very rural markets. Steve Coran some time ago issued an email that showed the census blocks by zip code that would be is 47 dBm, I think translates into 47 dB EIRP in a 20 megahertz channel. Well, as luck would have it, our radios can do that. So at 30 dBm per port, when you're aggregating 4 ports, you're at 36 dBm. Put on your antenna, boom, we can come right up to the limit. And I think that gives us a distinct advantage over all that stuff out there that's pushing 22 dBm per port. There's something called the Compact 3000. It's entirely the same as the other one, except it's operating in a couple different bands. So the 3.5 and the 3.65 band is what the LTE world calls bands 42 and 43. They actually do have a number for it. They actually do have a spec for it. For the Compact 3000, they operate in what the LTE world calls band 40, which we know as a WCS band 2.3, and bands 41, which is what most of us know as 2.5, think your local Catholic church or university, those frequencies. So the software and everything else, the functionality is entirely the same, except these are 40 dBm per port. So this is a beast power-wise. Thus, we have this box, which weighs about 43 pounds, compared to the other one, which weighs about 17. So that's all power amplifiers. So it's kind of a monster in that sense. I was asked I asked one of the guys, I think it was Boone, the other day. He and I were in Spokane, and I said, what are some of the things your guys will want to know? And one point he made is, antenna choices. So of course you do have choices. The one we prefer, in that we sell with it, is an Alpha brand, which is a company out of Ireland. They make really good stuff. It's not cheap, but it's excellent stuff. It's a 4-port antenna that's 65-degree dual slant, dual pole, 18 dBi antenna. Now, we have a lot of people saying, oh, I need a 90 or 120. And we really advocate against that unless you're pushing up against, or you're trying to keep your range very, very short. But there is no benefit. We have lots of hard data from the field, from hundreds and hundreds of deployed sectors, that shows that this antenna gives you coverage closer to about a 130, but does so by maximizing the power density and limiting, to a certain extent, the ambient exposure to interference out there. So it's a great antenna. It has a great pattern, as you can see here, and it provides really excellent coverage. That's the preference. There is 90s, there are 120 models that are 4 ports, but this, by and large, will cover most of your needs. There are some people, in some very rare cases, that will do omnis. All the does exist there. On the CPE side, there's actually a couple models, but the predominant model that most people are familiar with is the CP7000. The CP7000 comes standard with, built-in SIP, built-in iPerf, built-in ping, built-in surge protection. It's got 2 voice ports, RG11s on the PoE, which is of course included. Everything is included in this box. It's an IP67 box, which means it's dust proof, not dust protected, and it means it's fully submersible up to 3 meters for 30 minutes. Okay, is that going to happen? No, but what that means is that it's very well sealed. So in cases where you have really challenging thermal expansion, like for those of you in the Panhandle or something where you can actually see 50-degree temperature swings within a day or so, that kind of stuff is really rough on housings and the various Gulf on oil wells, that kind of stuff, and they hold up really nicely in environmentals. Something here I should point out. You'll notice that this is a dual mode CPE. In WiMAX mode, it's a 27 dBm. In LTE mode, we have a 4 dBm delta. That's because the chipset, that's because the chipset in LTE, what's called a Category 4 chipset, is limited by the standards bodies, which is 3GPP, to 23 dBm. So we have a little bit less power coming out of the CPE when it's in LTE mode. But we gain that back to a certain extent. And there will be a version coming next year when we do the LTE only CPE that will have a 27 dBm chipset. Got the built-in 15 dB antenna. It's a nice little box in it that screws out and it slots in and then screws back on. It's got a great magnifying window with 4 really clear LEDs and 4 color LEDs. So you can see this even from a couple stories down on the ground very plainly with a naked eye to know what's running. So you can even tell by how the colors are arranged that you've got full modulation and everything else. So it's a very, very easy radio, a CPE to work with. What it ships standard with is, as well as the basic pole mounting kit, which is included, It also includes this PoE. Of course, this international plug, this thing just pops out, and they have the US version. But you can see there's two RG11s on here, and again, that's standard. So there is an optional piece which has its FCC certification now, and we're getting some that replaces this PoE with this box. So this does 802.11n using 2.4, and so it's not AC, but it is N. But this pushes the PoE to the outside CPE, also has the POTS on it, and is also a router. So instead of having an ATA and a router and a PoE, you can have all that accomplished with one box for both a form factor that's relatively elegant and a price point that's considerably less than if you were to buy those three things individually, like a D-Link or whatever. The voice works really, really well. We do have a fair amount of people that do use it, but this is a nice solution because then you can offer Wi-Fi inside the home. You can manage the Wi-Fi AP over the network, or vice versa, or in the other direction. You can use that to even manage the CPE. So it's kind of an interesting arrangement. It's just an option, that's all. CPE that comes with N-type connectors costs a little bit more, but it is available where you can use something higher gain. We are also trying to get into production with a version of this exact CPE that does a 21 dBi integrated antenna. So whereas this is kind of like 10 inches from here to here, the 21 would be more like an 18-inch panel, but would give you significant increase in gain for the really super challenging areas. So here's one of the things everyone wants to know. Okay, what's the capability of the CPE if I'm connecting someone kind of in the real world? So I put this together. I have actually a more detailed version of this in Excel file that shows the SINARs and all that kind of stuff. But this, for the purpose of this presentation, talking about speeds in a 20 megahertz channel. To do the 10, you can essentially have that. For example, I did see a 10 megahertz channel doing 45 megs the other day in a trial in a non-line of sight situation. But anyway, in a 20 megahertz channel, either they're 60-40 sort of split, downlink, uplink, or 70-30, this kind of being more typical. You'll see one of the things that distinguishes us is we hold high modulations really, really well. So let's see, for example, even at, and we can do considerable capacity at those modulations. So even at minus 83.5, which is at a point where many of you guys, if you're using 5 gig gear, have stopped trying to connect things. We're still at QAM 64 on the downlink. So that's kind of a big deal. So we're talking about still better than 20 megs. Customers will try to limit to about, say, minus 80. And some, if they've got really high density, will say, okay, I'll keep everyone under minus 75. Because guess what? At minus 75, excuse me, you're at full boat of the radio. You're at QAM 64 and 5.6. So you're delivering max capacity at that point. And then, of course, you've got that divided up however you're doing it. But the speeds are really pretty exceptional compared to what you're used to. Even at minus 90, we're still doing really excellent speeds. And I've seen this borne out, and I know there's a couple of you on the call who have seen this, and things where they could only connect to 900, they're now able to connect with these radios, but doing speeds considerably better than they
come in, and some of them have to do with speeds and everything. So can you see these, or do you want me just to read them off to you real quick?
Let me jump to it. I had that window, excuse me, I got a drink of water here. I had that window closed so I could see the whole slide. Hold on. Okay, so let me pull this thing up here. Yeah, the window is tiny. That's strange.
I can read them too if you want me to.
Yeah, go ahead. Let's go ahead.
So the first question that came in is, what's the max MTU on CPE and base station?
Okay, got that. Okay, what's the next?
Next one is, what can we expect for latency and jitter on a link?
Let me get that one first because Nick, you're listening. So text me max MTU as I'm sitting here, and I'll go ahead and answer some of the other ones. We'll see how we make that work. The jitter stays consistent. It doesn't jump around. I know there are some technologies which jump from maybe 2 to 6 or whatever. Very, very consistent at about 1 to 2. Latency, the next slide will kind of cover that. That's implemented by the standard, and that really depends on the QoS setting as much as anything else. So we'll talk about that. It's about half of what it was under WiMAX, but we're all using it. When you're talking on your phone or you're doing streaming with a good connection, you're kind of experiencing the default or what LTE latency looks like, and it's a default bearer mode when it's unprioritized modes. So we'll hit that in just a second. What's the next question?
What speed packages are you seeing ISPs offer with your equipment, and how many customers on that?
Okay, it's a good question, and the truth is it's all over the map. Works, so they've started to scale. I've got a guy out there out west who's got 20 compact base stations up, in fact, already, and they're just kind of starting to add customers. What we will tell you, and what my engineers will tell me, is that in a streaming world, the safe oversubscription range is between 1 to 10 to 1 to 15. In the old days, and not very old days, like as in last year, we had customers that were even exceeding 1 to 30. I've got a customer on a 10 megahertz channel with 185, and that's been running fine for a long time, and we can see that historically, so we know that's not just some sort of aberration. It's very typical for people to have 80 to 100 users on a sector. That's very normal. The question is, what kind of capacities can you do? We think, given the current radio, in assuming about 75% availability of total capacity, meaning that you've got some that aren't connecting in the highest modulations, that you should be able to do somewhere in the area of about 50 customers doing 20 meg service. Okay, so the math is relatively simple. If you figure 75 megabits of availability, multiply that out times your oversubscription, and then divide it out, by whatever the number is. And that's kind of the easy way to compute it. We have a lot of historical data from the WiMAX world that tells us about our ratios and with these scheduled protocols kind of, but the scheduling and such is not. So we're pretty comfortable giving those kinds of examples of about 50 customers doing 20 meg service or so. And that would roughly double in about a year with multi-user MIMO, okay? Keep in mind, to do that, you've got to have most people connecting in your high modulations, but that's one of the things where we shine. People are connecting at high modulations, even at long range. In LTE, the requirement is we've got to do at 30 kilometers full boat. So in a line of sight world, we're doing 30 kilometers at the full modulation of the radio. So Nick, thank you, has texted me, and the MTU answer is 1900 on the EPC and the base station, and 1500 on the UE for the MTU size. What was one of the other questions?
got two more here real quick. How does the throughput?
Better than it does in a contention world, right, with a scheduler. One of the reasons we can, okay, so we kind of talked about that. There's this thing called equal rate and equal time. It exists both in WiMAX and it exists in LTE. When you're used to, many people are used to in the typical world that the customers on the edge are really impacting the performance of the network at large. We can manage that with these equal rate and equal time settings. The equal time setting says that the person, even at the edge of the cell that's connected in a worse modulation, isn't going to hose everyone else because you've set his time slot to be equal to anyone else's. Now, of course, that means he's getting less of a payload because he's on a lower modulation, but he can't take up more time slots. The other setting is equal rate. And with equal rate, you can say, okay, that guy on the edge can go this, would use more time slots. And it's the balance of those settings that define a lot of that. And that's really one of those are the kind of the subtleties that as you get to know this stuff that you have to adjust specific to your network environment. Because trust me, it's very different. You know, a guy in Montana that has relatively low density and users spread all over the place is going to be considerably different than, say, my guy out in Ocala, you know, doing a retirement community, which has got all the density he could fill up in 2 miles. You know what I mean? How you manipulate those settings really answers those questions a lot for you. But we can take those on a one-by-one basis. Probably not the best answer.
That's what we have for questions right now. So I'll. Okay. There's another one about how to get that high-powered list, but we can address that one-on-one afterwards.
Okay, so we'll jump on here to the QoS part. And we only have one slide. Again, we can cover this in depth, but if you look at the expected latency, this is what 3GPP defines. So this is what the standards body for LTE, of which there's $15 billion a year being invested in R&D throughout the world in LTE, which is worth noting, by the way, because we're on the beginning of the technology curve with this stuff, not in the end. So, you know, this is not a zombie technology. This is a baby that's just crawling out of the crib, and it's got a long way to go. So when the CPE first connects, everyone is issued the default bearer, which is the basic level standard, so to speak, or QoS model. And then you have the ability to kind of change those prioritizations as you wish to these various QCI kind of plans, I guess you might say. And you can see what those rates are in terms of latency relative to the prioritization that you might set. So this is, or you can share it, but kind of a general guideline. By the way, all this stuff too can be found on 3GPP.org's website. They have all this stuff enough to choke a horse if you're a masochist and want to really study this stuff under what standard and the kind of things that are coming. On the NMS side, the NMS managing this gear is different than they had under the old WiMAX stuff. So we've scrapped the old one, which was Java-based, which meant clunky and not exactly very elegant. It was perfectly functional, but it was a little bit frustrating. So this is much snappier. It uses netconf, which is kind of an emerging standard. Juniper uses it, for example. But it allows you to do widget-based stuff. It's very, very quick. There's a lot of configurability in how you use this thing and how you set up your windows. It's very friendly. It's very easy. You don't have to be with it. You've got the ability to set up your views, like in the command center. I was in Puerto Rico the other day. They got the map view. You can have that, or you can have any number of different views that you can pre-customize as your templates and just click and have available, and have everything pushed to your whatever. Your dashboards you can set up per subscriber, per sector, per cell, per network, with a quick views of the things that you want to see, again in widget form. So there's a lot of flexibility. Same with the KPIs. A lot of things at your fingertips. Very excited about this NMS because the old version was 3 different modules. This is no longer like that. It's not packaged in all these in 20,000 different pieces that were very confusing. The KPIs are part of the base management under this NMS, which is a big deal. Now, not many people have worked with this. In fact, I don't know if there's comes with the hardware-based EPC, which I'm about to show. And this is the last pieces that make this system a commercial system, right? The base stations have been ready for a long time, but we've been waiting for completion of these other elements and in what's called version 6.5, which is now there. And that includes this NMS. By the way, there's something coming with this NMS that allows, and I think the partners will be more excited than this and the customers, because you have this cloud NMS capability. So you could actually, you could have third-party manage your system, that sort of thing. If you are an organization that does some wholesaling, you would have the ability to have multiple networks coexisting and using the NMS appearing to be independent entities, which is kind of nice. One thing very cool and fun is that there will be a mobile app both for Android and iPhone first for this NMS. Ultimately, text an alert pop up that a base station has been hung by your climbers, and then you can just apply template and boom. So pretty neat stuff right from your phone or from some tablet or something like that to be able to see all the things you need to see, as if none of us, as if we all want to be connected even more. On the core, again, I know I'm going fast. Apologies on there. There's a lot of materials. LTE requires a core. To be standard, you have to do it. This is kind of a sore spot with me because there was a lot of WiMAX-ish stuff out there in the past, but that wasn't really WiMAX. It was a proprietary spin, and that includes most every major brand that had a quote-unquote WiMAX system. It wasn't really WiMAX. It was their own proprietary version of WiMAX. If you're truly standard, and if you ultimately want to be able to leverage that might come to the market, which could include cameras with embedded 355 chipsets, traffic systems, or additional CPE brands. This stuff matters. Standards matter. So in the LTE world, one of those things about that standard is this EPC, this enhanced packet core. This is where all the authentication happens. This is kind of the control basis of the network. This is where the policy controls and rules functions and all that sort of stuff happens. For us, there are multiple ways of doing that. Everyone's been operating off a VM structure right now, sitting on a blade in the server somewhere. But slowly beginning pretty much now, these guys will start being converted on over to this hardware platform, what we call the EPC 2020. This is a half U box in a market where an EPC typically can take 1 or 2 racks, literally 1 or 2 racks. Or 2 10 gig SFPs. Again, I'm sure Mike Hammett is very happy. And has 12 gig ePorts. Don't think there's any significance to the separation right here. That's just some venting. But this is, this is where you're interfacing to your radius or anything else. This is a piece that has to be there. It can be centralized, it can be distributed, it can be a hybrid solution, but it is a necessary part of the solution. And we've built this ourselves from soup to nuts. And damn, this is a lot harder than any of us thought. But we've just had the first 2 installed, 1 temporarily, to someone we all know and love out there in Puerto Rico, and so we do know it works, and we are looking forward to getting a whole bunch of more of these in-house, so all these guys in their trial networks, of which there's some 100, can start benefiting from this and the NMS and everything else that comes as part of this release here. The EPC, you can kind of see here in this general kind of diagram, its functionality, how it connects to the rest of the world. There is a CS model, which is what we call EPC 2020 cell site, which is even a more abbreviated solution in terms of pricing. And there's no abbreviation in terms of functionality. It's just a number of scale to subscribers. An EPC 2020 can handle up to 10,000 subscribers out of one box. And I think the hardware limitation is somewhere around 8 gigs, something like that. I believe that's the latest. So, you know, you can get by with one of these, or even if you want them redundant, there's a redundant price that makes it kind of half the original. But these are at a fraction of the cost of a normal LTE core. And the DoubleRadius guys can talk about that and price this stuff out to you. There's a couple basic modes. This is a typical LTE mode that you might be familiar with your default bearer. When the CPE attaches and it's able to register the UE, this is kind of how it's set up by default. Now you have the ability to do other modes where you can make a little tweaks. This is very similar to WiMAX 802.16e and the different QoS modes there. But there's also a unique one that we are doing to LTE, and no one else that I'm aware of is doing this in LTE yet, and that's layer 2 bridge mode. Now, there's one thing really important to note here. If you're going to do this, this is an LTE Plus feature. It's that ladder rack on top of a truck. If you are wanting to do this, then you have to use our CPE, because the CPE is not agnostic as it relates to this. It has to be able to do GRE tunneling, and that's available in our current CPE and the next generation. Then you can't just shop and do any LTE CPE. So that's on them, not on us. This is kind of interesting. I had a company that I asked, listen, do me a comparison of us to, in this case, the PMP 450 in terms of coverage with all things being equal. You pick where you want to do it. You pick the tower height. You pick the cell radius. Just give me a visual example. This is a company called Afterimage GIS, which does spectacular mapping. There are a couple guys that were RF genius kids in a grad program. They spun out what they were doing into a company, and they're about 12 years into it now, and they do some really cool stuff, and they can overlay with really detailed demographics, phone numbers, everything, and they can give you a high level of predictability, not only that you can connect a given address, but that you can do it at X modulation. They're very, very good. Not the cheapest guys out there, but if you want out rolling a truck without doing site surveys, which in our world is preferred, then guys like this have the tools to enable you to do that. So in any event, I let them pick a site. They picked Evansville, Indiana, because that's what they're most familiar with. They're right there in Muncie. They have all the clutter data on it. They decided to do it based off a 5-mile radius cell, and they only did the coverage. They only showed the coverage for QAM 64. So wherever QAM 64 breaks, that's where they stopped in terms of showing the capable coverage of both my system and, in this case, I think it's the 450. So that being said, they break QAM 64, I think, at -75. They're breaking QAM 64 and 5.6 at -67. So according to the Afterimage guys, they say that yields about 25% coverage of a 5-mile radius cell with whatever the AGL was and everything else on this thing. With us, all things being equal, we're not breaking QAM 64 until actually 83.5, so this was a little conservative. Yields about 70% coverage of that same cell, with all conditions being equal. This is one of the most salient points. Yes, we are more expensive, but we have the ability to connect significantly greater percentage of available customers in a given market with the same, with everything else being equal. Now, even if you add higher gain CPEs, which we can offer too, you can even increase that. And this, again, this is only at the top modulation, basically. So this is a cell that would be fully covered if you included the other, like QAM 16, for example. The reason, there's no voodoo here, there's nothing funky happening, it's just math. So we are 22. We are ultimately doing 4x4. We do 4x4 in WiMAX. Right now, we're up to 4x2 in LTE. But that's important because that's 3 dB additional on the receive versus 2x2. And we're breaking QAM 64 not until -75 compared to -67. So when you add all that stuff up, it's a really significant RF advantage. So it's just math. Really high-end DSPs, power is expensive, but all that. But that's why the performance non-line of sight is exceptional. What does that look like in the real world? So I've got some stuff here, the sheep shot. Many people have seen this. I'm going to jump over there. But instead of this, I'm going to go here. And Jeff, make sure that you can see this. Let me know.
Yeah, I got you here.
Okay, so I'm just going to scroll through. Here's a guy in Ocala from this tower. He's only about at 125 feet. He can go anywhere within this cell of or this sector. He can go up to 3 miles and stay under -75, anywhere in here. Okay, that's not as bad as some places in terms of the tree density, but that's a heck of a lot better than anything he had ever used before, which is why he completely changed his model. In some cases, he couldn't get a quarter mile. I wasn't even aware that some technologies, even with one tree in the middle, they consider that quote-unquote non-line of sight. That's crazy. That's line of sight in our world. This is an example. I believe this one was out of California, I think. This was a test site for a customer there that got, all these will be at least 20 megs, in some cases 40 and higher through these kinds of environments. This is a site up in Wisconsin. I've seen this at 7 miles with an indoor CP, a car, windows rolled up with a self-installed CPE, which is a 5 dBi antenna in the chassis of the indoor system, and doing from here -80, I think it was, which is pretty unbelievable at 7 miles away through that little wall of windbreak. This is, I believe this is in South Texas, around San Antonio, an area that this is a site that couldn't be connected with anything before, that is now connected. This is another, I think this is a South Texas site. These are all sites that they could not, literally people couldn't connect with at all, that are getting better than 20 megs or more. This is another one in Florida. This is a neighborhood where all the trees, it's buried underground utilities, and this is what the streets look like. Very thick live oak. This is outside of Durango, dense pine forest. This is a little over 1 mile. In this case, the customer trialing this, the tower is over back here. He was just holding it, you know, so obviously he wasn't stable at standing height going through this and was getting better than 20 meg. Even with this CPE laying down on the hood of this vehicle, they were streaming Transformers, one of the Transformers movies, without pixelation or anything. Getting better than 14 megs just sitting there like this with this kind of hood in the way. Another example, I'm not sure where this one was, but these are the kinds of environments, kind of from a visual sense, is why we're getting so many converts, because we're able to do something like this at -67 at almost 2 miles. This is a site outside of Orlando. This is a test site. We would, I think we this tree, and then the kind of ridges rises up, and the tower is about just 1.2 miles away, but there's a considerable, huge tree and another little wall of trees behind this, that sort of thing. So I just kind of wanted to jump and show those visuals before I moved on.
Patrick, we have a few more questions here real quick, just to run through before we move on. So a quick question here is, can we pull data with SNMP and are MIBs available?
Yes.
Okay. Someone asked if the NMS was included or if that's an extra cost.
The NMS there's a starter NMS. There is a cost for the NMS. Without it, you have basic command line functionality. It's how everyone is operating right now is without the NMS. But it can be done. It's less than ideal. But yeah, so the NMS, there is a charge for the NMS.
And then here's an interesting question here, is on layer 2 bridging, I am using a PureWave 6600 with green packet WiMAX CPEs.
Mm-hmm.
I replace the 6600, keep my green packet CPEs running in layer 2 mode.
In WiMAX, not in LTE, right? So it's like the PMP320s. You can use that CPE because it is inherently, it is a WiMAX CPE, even though they kind of put their own little proprietary spin on it. So you can connect in WiMAX mode using those CPEs. You cannot connect in LTE mode. It's a totally different chip, totally different protocol. But in WiMAX mode, yeah. So that's one of the reasons we're getting a lot of 320 customers, because they don't have to do a forklift and move to something like 450 where in WiMAX mode with the CPEs they have deployed out there in the field, and then they could flop one sector over to LTE, and the CPEs that they've switched out will automatically flop on over to LTE. There's a couple models of how you transition, and they're all actually pretty easy. But yeah, we've seen this now with PureWave CPEs, with Cambium 320s. So yeah, without a doubt.
Okay, that covers the questions we have so far, so I'll let you carry on. Thank you.
Okay, one of the things I just kind of wanted to close with, unless there's more questions, is I love this business. It's a very fun space, but I get really kind of excited when people send unsolicited emails either to me directly, to others on our team, or they post these things. And that's when it's really, really fun. And whenever I see them, if I've got my wits about me, I try to keep them. A couple here that I collected that I think are worth sharing. And I've got them in their entirety to, well, some of these are excerpts, but I've tried to leave the stuff that's important. So excuse me for reading some of these, but here's one. It says, we got our first base station up yesterday. This is a company that has actually quite a few base stations. So far, the testing has been impressive. Just for the hell of it, I brought a CPE home and set it on my living room table, connected right up at -13. Now, -13, that's RSRP. In LTE, if you want to translate to RSSI, basically add 30. So a -113 in RSRP would be about a -83 in RSSI, okay? So connected right up at essentially what is a -83 and consistently delivered 20 megs throughput. I'm feeling this is going to be fun again. It's nice to be excited. And then about 30 minutes later, the same guy sends an email a little bit, and now it's at 36 megs down. That's 365. That's not 2.5 in his house. So that's kind of fun. Next one was a IT manager in Texas who has a lot of familiarity with WiMAX, but he put one up and then just kind of drove around with a CP laying on his dash of his truck or of his car. And actually, because yeah, he has a Volt, so this is a Texas guy with a Volt car. Kind of made me laugh. But anyway, he's driving around saying he never lost a signal from one end of his town to the other. Now it's a small suburb outside of Dallas, but I think most of us understand what that terrain and what that environment looks like. So that's pretty impressive. And there's John up in New York who says, this is a fun one, changes everything. It's like showing a very cold caveman fire for the first time. I really don't know how to describe it. So I'm getting these things kind of over and over and over again. So I And this is one of the last ones I'll read in its entirety here. We have seen exceptional results when testing Telrad's equipment. Our terrain is rough at best, abrupt elevation changes with thick forest throughout our network footprint. And they've tested other products with limited success. So the testing so far with this has been excellent. And then you can kind of finish. They even did voice calls in exception of 30 miles or over 30 miles away with really good results. I would love to name this guy, but I can't yet because they just don't want themselves to be known as a convert yet. Anyway, it's one kind of after the other, and some of these guys are pretty tough customers. Is this stuff perfect? No, there's still plenty of frustrations because there is some newness and there's a big learning curve. Like I said, you could be the best airplane mechanic on the planet, but if all you get you up to speed on jets, there's a learning curve, and that curve can be somewhat frustrating, especially if you don't have the NMS, which most of these guys in the trial don't have. They should all have them pretty soon, but put it this way, the base stations aren't coming back. There's about 100 trials, and I've got 2 that have come back. One of those was a person I think is rather questionable. I'm not sure his deal. The other one was a guy in the Appalachian Mountains who just doesn't have the demographics to support it. And when I say that, I think he probably thought maybe he could only see, as rural as he was and as dense as it was and as thick, he could only get to about 15 customers, which is more than he could with anything else, but still not enough to justify the cost of these things. I understand that it's not for everyone, but the fact that only 2 have come back after all these is rather very easy. Trial programs, the DR people can work with you on that. We will stay close to you no matter how who at DoubleRadius you're working with. We have to stay real close until we get you and everyone up to speed. But we'd love to have a shot, and that's it. Any more questions?
Patrick, yeah, there's a couple more that have rolled in real quick. What kind of interference mitigation does your system have?
Okay, that's good. So everyone has to live with interference. There is no magic bullet in dealing with it. In some ways, you deal with it just like you do always with, good engineering practices. But LTE does bring a couple things that you won't find in other technologies. One of these things, for example, and this is rather interesting. The CPEs are constantly reporting their interference. Those guys too, and in that world, they're expecting you to be driving around at 80 miles an hour, where the interference state is constantly changing. So, in any event, the UEs, the CPEs report their state, pretty real frequently to the base station, basically in real time, and the base station then is able to actually say you're operating off a 20 megahertz channel. If the CPE is reporting that, say, the first front end of that 20 megahertz channel is being heavily interfered upon, the base station can actually adjust the payload more towards the other frames that are being less interfered with, and can do that dynamically. That's a pretty cool feature that LTE is capable of doing. So that helps. I'm not aware of that being anywhere else. There's also a couple of things called flexible. And Nick, I may have you jump on just for this point. Mute, and I'll ask Jeff Hollenrid to find you among the list and to unmute you. But there's also something called coordinated multipoint, which isn't yet there, but it's a feature in LTE that we're bringing into the radio. It's on the roadmap. In coordinated multipoint, what happens there is what's basically your own self-interference that you've always tried to mitigate in the LTE world, that gets multiplexed to improve the gain of your link. There's that. Nick, are you on yet?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
I can. Fantastic. Thank you, Jeff, for assisting. Can you hit on what is it? The selected, or what is it? Selective scheduling, whatever the heck it is.
Channel selective scheduling, because it is a scheduled protocol and because it relies on real-time feedback from the subscriber, the subscriber's consistently relaying channel state reports, also known as CQI, so channel quality indication, related. The base station can take that data, store that data, and leverage it within an algorithm to schedule that user to the most optimal subcarriers, are known as resource elements within the channel space. So essentially it's called channel selective scheduling, or frequency selective scheduling, because it's building logic on a real-time basis with regards to partial overlap within the channel, and then not necessarily impacting the entire coverage. It could be partial to the left or the right, or one section of the coverage area, and those subscribers can then be scheduled to resources that are deemed less interference or better quality.
So guess who the engineer is and who isn't the engineer? Thanks, Nick. Stay on the line if you don't mind.
No problem.
So I think you answered that. Was there anything else in particular that I didn't think about, which is probably true with respect to interference mitigation?
Well, I think that you kind of touched on the overall requirements, certainly with the enhanced intercell interference coordination and coordinated multipoint, which are they're really roadmap features, but because it is a global standard, and these features are firmly defined, and that's what the technology is evolving to.
Okay, I see something on price there, which the DoubleRadius guys will individually answer. I will say that on CP, it's all baked in, right? So you're not paying extra for the antenna. You're not paying extra for PoE. You're not paying extra for surge protection. You're not paying extra for VoIP features. You're not paying extra for higher capacity because there are no caps. There's none of that kind of gamesmanship. It is what it is and what it is. So
Patrick, if you're looking at the questions right now, we're down to the bottom 5.
Okay, the strange thing on my view, the window, excuse me, the window is
small. Quick question here on, do you have a recommended ARPU?
No, I don't. I mean, it's your business, and
yeah, exactly.
There are so many different WISPs with so many different models. Your best bet is to consult with, your friends in the industry relative to the kind of things you're doing. And I don't know what's happening in your competitive environment, right? I don't know if you've got the cable guys there doing something. I don't know if you're also doing fiber. So I'd love to be able to answer that. I could maybe offer recommendations as a team, but I don't have any off-the-cuff answer that would be honest.
Yeah, we had another question in here about, do we provide assistance with licensing and the FCC? And we can. That's something that we need to hit up with your reps here at DoubleRadius. We'll get Patrick or the sales manager for Telrad involved for your territory, and we can go through licensing and that. So we can all stay tight-knit on that one. But please engage your account managers or engage Telrad directly, and we can definitely help out on that part.
Yeah, I mean, I clearly have, so yeah. That's case by case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So next one, how well does your system scale as to adding more base stations at one location? Is it all done by GPS?
Since you're live, if you don't mind, would you handle the scaling issue?
Sure, absolutely. You can hear me, can you?
Yeah, great.
Okay, perfect. So absolutely we can scale. Everything is 1 PPS, or 1 packet per second, synchronized via GPS, of course. We can chain GPS antennas between multiple base stations and share a sync source, even regardless the common sync source is the GPS 1 packet per second, or sorry, 1 pulse per second. That said, absolutely we can scale at one single location. Designs, gigabit capable towers. This is, we call it reuse 2 with just 2 frequencies. You can stagger ABAB or 1212 360 degrees around a tower and still maintain a very reliable service. That said, even moving further, LTE really defines a lot of interference mitigation techniques for self-interference, self-synchronized interference. Things like intercell interference coordination would allow you to configure the same frequency all within a single location and have the base stations or the E-node Bs negotiate cell edge resources in such a way that it minimizes overlap at the subcarrier level from one subscriber to the next on adjacent sectors using the same channel. So certainly, if there is a product that will scale, it is absolutely this one, and well beyond a lot of the other proprietary technologies, because really this is designed to scale to the million subscriber counts and well beyond. It's not necessarily specific to any and technology that we've really adapted and to some extent we're perfecting for the fixed wireless market.
And then the last question, because I know we're running a little over schedule here, but the last question that we have here for you all gentlemen is what about running all APs in the same channel? Someone had mentioned that you'd brought that up in a webinar before this about running APs in the same channel.
Yeah, that's what Nick just mentioned with what they call reuse one. The ability to do that is LTE specifically defines features that enable that. You know, there are some LTE vendors that say, oh, we can do LTE or we can do reuse one now. In the cellular world, I think it's still one of those technologies that's still not yet to be 100% there, but it's certainly defined within the standard. And we do have people doing reuse 2, and we have people to a certain extent, you know, where there are some caveats that you have to be careful and engineer your way through, but it can be done now. Nick?
Yeah, that is absolutely correct. Some of the larger vendors from the mobile industry really lead with that as their selling feature, and a lot of the people that buy into it right up front have struggled to make it work simply because it's a roadmap capability. It's certainly the most bit per hertz as far as spectral efficiency in the long run. That said, the industry is not there. You need to consider that in the mobile industry, subscribers have very low power omni antennas. In the fixed wireless industry, we have directional antennas with much higher gain. So we really need the intercell interference coordination to be 100% in order to enable this. Otherwise, once you scale, your overall uplink will immediately be impacted for one. But additionally, the overall struggles with refers to that we can engineer our way through it, certainly with aggressive down tilt and minimizing overlap on the coverage perspective, simply with physics and down tilt and so forth. We can make it work, even pre-interference mitigation techniques like ICIC, but again, it's a very delicate process and it requires very careful engineering, and it always comes with a trade-off. Ultimately, it's not going to be as effective on a signal-to-noise interference perspective as something such as a reuse 2, which is our more preferred method, certainly in the short term, with back-to-back reuse and so forth.
Yeah, the good news is, especially on 365 and 355, there's going to be a lot of spectrum to work with. I mean, we've all been living with 5.7 for a gazillion years since all of us have been in the business. And sure, it's pretty darn crowded, but you know, just consider that when you think of 150 megahertz of total spectrum from 355 to 3.7, there's a lot that isn't consumer devices like you do have in 5.7. So I expect it's going to be an awful long time before we all have to seriously worry about high levels of interference in that space. Until then, you're just doing your normal, you know, you're managing through it. I know some individual selective markets, you know, have lots of 365 operators, but this is in a pre-SAS world as well. So, you know, I haven't found a case where it's not manageable yet. Certainly haven't lost a customer in 365 because they couldn't work their way through their issues. I'm not sure anyone has, and any vendor. Maybe they have, I don't know, but we certainly haven't. Anything else, Jeff?
No, that's what I got here. Well, sorry, there was one more. Was the NMS included in the 2020 Breezeway?
The NMS is loaded into not included in the EPC cost. It's a separate line item, separate piece of software. Is that how it works? Tell me, Nick, because I'm not sure on that one.
Yeah, the BreezeView is the network management system, and yes, it's absolutely a separate component. It's used to manage both the base station and the EPC, but also we will soon be bringing the TR69 or the subscriber level provisioning via BreezeView as well.
Yeah, is that loaded into the EPC though? Does that get loaded into? Where does that get loaded? Well, I guess it sits on a server somewhere, or what?
Yeah, it's we can transport it as a virtual appliance. It's essentially runs on like a CentOS, so it would run on your own infrastructure unless you were subscribing to, say, a managed service from your VAR, or in this case, DoubleRadius.
Okay, thanks.
Well, that's what we have for all the questions. Yeah.
Jeff and team, we really appreciate it. I hope it was useful to folks, and I'm sure there'll be some.
Yeah, for those of y'all that are still on, please get with your account managers at DoubleRadius. Reach out to us with any other questions you get from this. We are recording this, and we will be posting it so you can go back to it, get answers, and or if you have other questions from watching it again, please feel free to reach out. We're here to help. Patrick, Nick, thank you guys so much for being here, and the attendees, thank you guys for taking the time and wanting to learn something new and advance into the future. So with that, we're going to wrap this up. Thank you again to everybody, and good luck. Thanks.
Cheers.